The world did not wake up one morning ready for another war. It arrived there slowly, reluctantly, almost unwillingly. After the first war ended, people promised themselves one thing above all else: never again. They said it in speeches. They wrote it into treaties. They taught it to their children. But promises alone do not rebuild a broken world. The years that followed World War I were meant to heal. Instead, they exposed how deep the damage truly was. Entire nations were left unstable, economies fragile, populations exhausted. People were not dreaming of conquest. They were trying to survive. Savings disappeared overnight. Jobs vanished. Food became uncertain. The war had taken years of their lives. The peace took their confidence. In many places, humiliation replaced hope. Not loud humiliation, quiet, persistent. People felt watched, judged, restricted. They felt their future had been decided by others, far away. That feeling mattered, because people can endure hardship, but they struggle to endure humiliation. Governments tried to manage the crisis. They adjusted policies. They reassured citizens. They asked for patience. But patience had already been spent. The systems built to protect stability moved slowly, too slowly for people who were losing everything. Fear returned, not fear of bombs, fear of falling into poverty, falling into irrelevance, falling into chaos. This fear did not push people toward war. It pushed them toward certainty. Anyone who sounded confident gained attention. Anyone who spoke without doubt felt trustworthy. They promised restoration. They promised dignity. They promised control. These promises did not begin as threats. They began as comfort. People listened, not because they wanted violence, but because they wanted relief. Across nations, identity hardened. National pride became a shield. History became a weapon. Past grievances were remembered differently now, sharpened, simplified. The idea that suffering had meaning became attractive, that loss could be redeemed. Fear reshaped politics. It narrowed choices. It rewarded strength over caution. Compromise began to feel dangerous. Weakness began to feel fatal. The world had learned the wrong lesson from the First War. It believed the mistake had been action, when the mistake had been failure to heal. Silence replaced cooperation. Delay replaced responsibility. Aggression did not appear suddenly. It emerged gradually, testing, probing, and each test that met no resistance changed expectations. People told themselves, this is not war. This is temporary. This can still be stopped. But stopping something requires action, and action still felt too risky. The fire did not begin with flames. It began with pressure. Pressure on economies. Pressure on governments. Pressure on people who felt cornered. Pressure changes behavior. When pressure builds long enough, something gives. This was the world standing at the edge of the Second War. Not rushing, not screaming, but no longer able to turn back. The failure of peace had created something new. Not conflict yet, but momentum. And momentum does not wait for permission. As fear spread and stability weakened, something else began to grow alongside it. Confidence, not the quiet confidence of recovery, but a louder kind, sharper, more certain. It appeared first in words, speeches that sounded sure of themselves, promises that did not hesitate, statements that left no room for doubt. In a world exhausted by uncertainty, confidence felt like relief. People had spent years listening to warnings, to cautions, to careful explanations. They were tired of being told to wait, tired of being told that things were complicated. So, when voices appeared that sounded decisive, people noticed. These voices did not speak of patience. They spoke of action. They spoke of restoring what had been lost, of correcting injustice, of reclaiming dignity. They simplified the past. They clarified the present. They promised control over the future. For people who felt humiliated or ignored, this confidence mattered more than facts. Confidence gave shape to anger. It gave direction to fear. Slowly, the tone of public life began to change. Careful language sounded weak. Bold language sounded honest. Doubt was reframed as disloyalty. Questioning was reframed as obstruction. The world had not suddenly embraced extremism. It had embraced certainty. Confidence made people feel protected. It replaced confusion with purpose. And once people feel protected, they are willing to follow. Governments noticed this shift. Some resisted it. Others adapted to it. Many underestimated it. They believed confidence would fade, that reality would slow it down. Instead, it accelerated. Confidence does not ask permission. It pushes forward. As confidence grew, restraint weakened. Rules began to feel optional. Agreements felt flexible. Past limitations were reinterpreted. Old restrictions questioned. All described as reasonable, necessary, overdue. The memory of the First War was still present, but it no longer restrained action. It was reinterpreted. The lesson was no longer, never again. It became, never be weak again. This shift mattered more than any single policy, because it changed how people understood safety. Safety was no longer associated with cooperation. It was associated with strength. Nations began to test this idea carefully, deliberately. Small steps, limited actions, each step designed to look justified. Defensive, corrective responses from others were cautious, measured. They did not want escalation. They wanted stability. But stability without resistance creates momentum. Each unchallenged move reinforced confidence. Each delay confirmed belief. Confidence fed on silence. The world watched as norms softened, as boundaries blurred. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the danger. Confidence does not feel like threat. It feels like direction. People adjusted to the new tone. They accepted new language, new expectations. What once felt aggressive now felt assertive. What once felt dangerous now felt necessary. Confidence spread across borders, not identical everywhere, but recognizable. It reshaped diplomacy. It reshaped priorities. It reshaped imagination. War was still unthinkable, but confrontation was no longer impossible. This was the moment when restraint lost its authority, not because people wanted destruction, but because confidence convinced them that destruction could be controlled. The world had entered a new phase. Fear had prepared the ground. Confidence had stepped onto it, and together they began to move history forward. Confidence does not stay still. Once it takes root, it looks for proof. Belief demands action, even small action. The first moves were careful, measured, designed not to alarm. They were framed as corrections, as adjustments, as rightful claims. Each move was justified by history, by grievance, by necessity. And each move asked the same quiet question: will anyone stop this? At first, the answer was unclear. Other nations watched closely. They issued statements. They expressed concern. But concern is not resistance. The fear of escalation still outweighed the fear of aggression. The first moves did not feel like war. They felt administrative. Borders were adjusted, rules reinterpreted, agreements revised. Everything was explained as temporary. Temporary actions have a way of becoming permanent. People responded cautiously. Some felt uneasy, others felt relieved. Relief mattered. It reinforced confidence. Each successful move strengthened belief, belief that limits were negotiable, belief that resistance would not come. Confidence grew sharper, less patient. Actions that once required justification now required only explanation. The tone shifted again, from reassurance to expectation. Those watching from outside struggled to respond. They feared that strong resistance would provoke conflict. They feared that inaction would invite more. So they chose the familiar path: delay. Delay created momentum. Each step forward changed the situation, changed the calculation. The cost of response increased. The cost of silence seemed lower. This imbalance mattered because it shaped future decisions. Confidence became self-confirming. Each move justified the next. People began to speak differently, less about prevention, more about preparedness. Language adjusted quietly. The world was not mobilizing, but it was repositioning. Military planning resumed, not aggressively, not openly, as insurance, as precaution. Precaution became normalization. People adjusted emotionally. They told themselves this was manageable, that it could be contained, but containment requires control, and control was slipping. Each first move was small enough to seem tolerable. Together, they formed a pattern of advance. History was not repeating itself yet, but it was aligning. The world had entered the phase where intention mattered less than motion. Stopping now would require confrontation. Confrontation would require courage, and courage was still scarce. The first moves were complete. The direction was set. What followed would no longer be hypothetical. The world did not cross into war all at once. It stepped forward, then paused, then stepped again. By the time anyone realized where the path led, turning back no longer felt possible. The early moves had changed more than borders. They had changed expectations. What had once felt unthinkable now felt manageable. Aggression had not been stopped. It had been accommodated. Each decision made to avoid conflict had quietly narrowed the choices that remained. The cost of resistance grew heavier. The cost of silence seemed lighter. People told themselves this balance could hold, that stability could still be preserved, but stability built on hesitation is fragile. As confidence hardened, so did behavior. What had begun as adjustment became assertion. The world responded carefully, too carefully. Leaders spoke of restraint, of responsibility, of patience. But restraint without limits invites testing. Testing became routine. Routine became expectation. The illusion of control lingered. People believed they could manage events, guide them, contain them. But events do not wait for agreement. Behind closed doors, preparations deepened, not for war. They said, for security. Security requires readiness. Readiness requires acceptance. Acceptance came quietly. The idea that conflict might return no longer shocked anyone. People adjusted their thinking, their planning, their language. War became imaginable, then plausible. The space between peace and conflict disappeared. This moment mattered, because once war becomes imaginable, it becomes possible. And once it becomes possible, it begins to shape decisions. The world had reached a threshold, not marked by explosions, not by decorations, but by resignation. Resignation that some things could not be stopped, that some paths could not be reversed. People still hoped, but hope had changed. It was no longer hope for prevention. It was hope for control. Control over damage. Control over timing. Control over responsibility. This hope was fragile and misplaced. The First War had taught the world how quickly control could be lost. The years that followed had taught it how easily warnings could be ignored. Now the lesson was about to be repeated. The final step toward catastrophe was not aggression. It was acceptance. Acceptance that confrontation was too dangerous. Acceptance that delay was safer. Acceptance that events could be managed later. Later never came. The moment for reversal passed quietly, and with it passed the last chance to avoid what followed. The world did not realize it had crossed the line, but it had. The war that everyone feared was no longer avoidable. It was approaching, not suddenly, but inevitably.